Hello, I'm Gabriel Nadales for the Leadership Institute's Campus Reform. And I'm here talking with journalist Andy Ngo, who is the author of the new book, Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. Thank you for joining us, Andy.
Thanks for having me on. I've been looking forward to speak with you.
It's a pleasure. So, Andy, tell us, in your own words, what is Antifa? And also, why do you seem to be Antifa public enemy number one?
So, Gabriel, out of all the people who've interviewed me, you're the only one who's actually also written a book on Antifa. So I'm very much looking forward to your questions. To simply answer the question you just posed, Antifa is a movement and ideology that claims to be anti-fascist. But what it is made up of people who are anarchists and communists who view the United States as an enemy, and not just the US, the nation state, but its founding ideals. So the attacks against property and law enforcement and other people strike at the heart of freedom of expression, the rule of law, and other Enlightenment values that undergird not just American society, but the allies of America's, the values of America's Western liberal allies. And I've become public enemy number one because I was one of the most effective people in really shining a light onto the violent extremism. I had an advantage in that I was based out of Portland, Oregon. So being at the epicenter of American Antifa violence allowed me to be at the forefront of seeing what was going on. And it wasn't just last year, it's been going on for a number of years now. The first time I came face to face with Antifa, even though I didn't know at that time, was in November 2016, after the surprise win of Donald Trump. And the response from Portlanders were to take to the streets, probably more than 10,000 people. And within that were organized groups of marauding thugs dressed in the same uniform. Now I know that tactic's called Black Bloc. I write about that a lot in the book. But they were smashing property, starting fires, carrying melee weapons, and they rioted for 3 days, which was quite shocking at that time for me. But as you and the viewers and listeners may be aware, Portland ended up having more than 120 days of daily recurring violence throughout 2020, and violence that is still happening to this moment.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that you mentioned it right now, and in your book, you also claim that Antifa is trying to destroy democracy. And one thing that I often hear when I give speeches about Antifa on college campuses is left-wing students tell me that Antifa is actually trying to protect democratic values. And in fact, some of these students even claim to be members of the Young Democratic Socialists of America. So let me ask you this. Is it possible to both support liberal democracies and Antifa?
No, they are opposite worldviews and ideologies. And actually, the original subtitle for the book that I wanted it to be was Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Liberal Democracy. But that it was already so long as it is, so it was shortened. But yeah, so if you talk to some of the Antifa militants and ideologues and their fellow travelers and supporters, they will say, oh no, we respect democracy, that each person has a vote and voice in how they are governed. And it's just talking about pure democracy in terms of having a say in one's governance. Sure, that's true. You can see that they have some sort of rudimentary systems that have been set up in their various autonomous communes when they've had the opportunity to experiment in that. But what I'm talking about is not just a system that allows people to have a voice in how they're governed. I'm talking about liberal democracy, which is what people usually mean when they're talking about democracy or the promotion of it. So that would include the rule of law, the protection of human rights, freedom of expression, the right to property, all of these things that totalitarian regimes, communist regimes target. They don't protect these rights for these people, even if, for example, the Democratic Republic of Korea, otherwise known as Korea, they always have that name democratic in it. the DDR, which is German Democratic Republic, also known as East Germany, when it was under communist rule. So so Antifa use it in a way sort of as a misnomer. For the students that you encounter on campus who are part of the DSA and such, I think the DSA, just by their own manifestos that they put out and their party plans, they're a socialist group, a socialist party, which is why so many of them become either supporters of Antifa or eventually members of militant Antifa movements. The Democratic part of the DSA is just a thing that was added on for branding, because a socialist party in the US does carry negative connotations, fortunately. But that is the concern over socialism or Marxism or any of these left-wing ideologies. The stigma around that is fading.
I think you're 100% right. So many people just like to throw out the word democracy just to sound good to the American public. And, I think that fortunately, although it went through so much chaos, Parliament went through so much chaos, I think that 2020 really showed Americans that Antifa was not imaginary. And also that, in fact, Antifa was several different groups who were intent, as you say, to destroy American liberal democracy. And in your book, though, you dedicated an entire chapter to Portland's Rose City Antifa, which is the oldest Antifa group in America. And I'm really interested in how you cover the fact that the training for Rose City Antifa members resembles a university course. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so in the book, for the first time, some of these primary documents that were leaked to me by somebody who went through the membership process for Rose City Antifa, which is an actual formal Antifa organization that has a membership process, a vetting process, and most crucially, a training and radicalization process. And so these documents are published in full in the book. And you see with the curriculum that on the surface, it can look sort of benign in that you have weekly, monthly meetings that stretch over many, many months. Each of the meetings is also followed by a discussion of the literature that is assigned. But if you go more and more through the curriculum, you see that incrementally people are introduced to really radical theories. And these theories are what provides sort of the ideological justification for their acts of terrorism, essentially, and killings. And if you go further into the curriculum, where it becomes extremely disturbing is that there's training on how to fight and how to use guns and all that. So these are people who really believe themselves to be revolutionaries, and they're an anti-government violent extremist movement and ideology. They seek explicitly to overthrow the US government. That's the ultimate agenda. That's a big thing to do. So instead what they're doing is destabilizing local cities where they have sway, and they've gained quite immense power in the Pacific Northwest, Portland and Seattle. Seattle is where Antifa and their BLM allies seized territory for more than 3 weeks. And that devolved until homicides, shootings, attempted rapes, mass vandalism, property destruction, and people who lived in that area were held hostage. I write about my time in the Chaz, the so-called autonomous zone.
Which I found interesting. I wasn't aware that you were inside of Chaz, but go on.
So Antifa, it's not just theory for them. You can actually look at what happens when they put their beliefs into practice.
Yeah.
So when it comes to actually state building or building a commune, building a community, they can't build anything that is able to produce either a society that people want to live in or a society that is safe. What really happens is it leads to violence, intimidation, and death even. In December, Antifa also created an autonomous zone in a residential part of Portland, and families there and people, they had to flee for their lives essentially. And Antifa also created a hard border at that time. It was manned by their armed militias who were open carrying guns. They set booby traps on the streets. Like this is happening in major American cities. And so with what happened in the Capitol on the 6th of January with the riot and siege there, I was just appalled that the people who were loudest in condemning that, and the journalists who were loudest against that, which they should be. They were silent last year when other American cities were under siege, literally by a movement that considered itself insurrectionary. And not only did they also killed people, they injured law enforcement, and they call as a feature of their ideology, they call for violence.
Yeah, it's definitely a problem. And what it seems to me that some of these communists, excuse me, that it seems to be they're sometimes allowed to be there by government officials. But I also recall reading in your book that during the 2020 Portland riots, there were several professors who were arrested. And I mean, you specifically mentioned Portland State University geography instructor Alexander Reed Ross, and who is somebody who is helps train Rose City Antifa members. So what role do you think universities have in promoting or legitimizing Antifa to the mainstream American public?
So if you just look at Antifa from the riots, you might think that the violence is nihilistic in that they are just breaking things just to break things. But there's actually a really deep ideology, and they intellectualize their violence. And they're able to do that because they have these so-called intellectuals and thinkers who not only write the literature and help disseminate it, but in the case of Mr. Alexander Reed Ross, who's an instructor at Portland State University, who's written for publications like The Independent and other news sites. I reveal in the book, he's one of the names that I list who actually provided training to Rose City Antifa, was part of the radicalizing of others. So people have to realize, to go from somebody who's, let's say, a Bernie supporter at one point, and then at a future point, picking up arms to either hurt, kill, maim, or be killed in the process of carrying out attacks. There's a whole, there are a lot of steps in between. So that's why the publication of the curriculum in Unmasked is important, because you can see, at least in how one group does it. Rose City Antifa is just one group and part of the Torch network. There are numerous other cells. And the thing is, I don't want people to get too attached to the name Antifa. It doesn't really matter what they call themselves. So you can have, there's the Youth Liberation Front, which was one of the main groups who organized the months of riots in Portland. Other groups, they don't have Antifa in the name at all, but you look at their literature and you look at who they're connected to and the networks they're part of, and you see it's all part of the same ideology, working towards the same goal, autonomously, which is important because it does make dismantling them much harder.
I mean, one of the things that I found when I was part of the movement is that there really isn't one cohesive like Antifa, but there's multiple different little groups. They're called affinity groups, and they can have I don't know, Los Angeles Against Racism, but it's all part of the Antifa thing, the whole network. But one of the things that I found incredibly fascinating about your book is that you talk about the cultural aspects of Antifa and how modern Antifa was reborn out of the punk and oi music movements in the United Kingdom and how they were later exported to America. As you may already know this, I first joined Antifa through the anarcho-punk music movement in the early 2010s, which used music as a vehicle to promote anarchist ideologies. So my question is, do you see American Antifa exploiting mainstream culture in the same way that the UK Antifa groups did in the 1980s?
Initially, yes. So the founding of these early chapters in the US for these Antifa groups, going back just a couple of decades, was very rooted in punk subculture and the various literatures that were originally written in the UK and then imported, exported to America and other English-speaking societies. But there's been a mainstreaming of Antifa, particularly, I would say the turning point was after the election of Trump, in that it no longer was really just about the punk subculture, even though that's still there. It became a very mainstream thing on the left because now Antifa's fringe radical ideology movement suddenly had salience to liberals in the mainstream left because they actually fooled themselves into believing that the election of Trump was a sign of ascendant American fascism and that we were on the precipice of another Holocaust. And so Antifa's ideology then was given legitimacy in that mainstream liberal journalists, institutions, which would have in the past not been okay with acts of political violence. Now they did tolerate it and they celebrated it, actually. You saw how first it was, celebrated to punch a Nazi. Okay, that's a meme, but who do you call a Nazi? I mean, Antifa calls me a Nazi. To call anybody who poses them a Nazi. The historical Antifa, when they were a paramilitary of the German Communist Party, those people that they consider fascists, in addition to the actual Nazis, were the Social Democrats, the liberals of Germany at that time. So from its founding till now, all through the decades, Antifa calls who and how they define fascism is extremely broad, and essentially comes down to anybody who opposes them. So they legitimize physical violence against people who have wrong think or different opinions, and then they legitimize looting and destruction of property. I mean, NPR interviewed a woman who wrote a book called In Defense of Looting, and was providing, again, this radical ideological justification for acts of property destruction. So I think that's the big victory of Antifa, is not necessarily that they've been able to carry out wanton violence on the streets, but actually they've been able to make inroads in the mainstream left and to increase the palatability of their extremist message, to the point now where a lot of people on the left don't find Antifa extreme, actually, because what they are calling for and advocating has been embraced by parts of the mainstream left.
So what can you tell me about the Black Lives Matter movement? Because do you see Antifa and BLM as one and the same, or are they different? Because it seems that whenever you have a BLM demonstration, the Antifa Black Bloc is not far behind.
Good observation and good point. That's right. They are different movements with different ultimate agendas. But as of now, I really consider them a fused and coalition or entity. I just call it BLM-Antifa because they, at least in some areas, really are one and the same. And you can look at things that, for example, the DC chapter of Black Lives Matter, they actually have put out on their social media during the riots last year, calling for people to come support the Antifa comrades. Antifa in the Pacific Northwest and other areas will act as volunteer security, volunteer militia at BLM rallies. And of course, in Minnesota, when there were neighborhoods being torched to the ground, the people who initiated the looting, or the chain reaction of looting that eventually led to buildings being burnt, were the breaking of windows, and that was carried out by people in an organized manner dressed in black bloc. So BLM, I think, what makes it very hard for a lot of people to criticize BLM or Antifa is they think that if you are against Antifa, that you're pro-fascism. If you're against BLM, you're pro-racism or something. And that's this juvenile trick that the press has allowed so many people to be cowed into silence. There's a whole chapter on BLM in the book, because you can't really write about American Antifa without writing about BLM, because Antifa, particularly in 2020, were carrying out their acts of violence in the name of Black Lives Matter. Literally, they would chant it. They would work with one another. That's the messaging they would write. And when they were writing in the name of people like George Floyd or Jacob Blake or other people. So they're fighting for the same cause as of now, and that's because both of them have a shared mutual enemy in what America stands for, the Republic itself. And you don't have to just take my word for it. You can look at the writings and statements from the founders of BLM, the three women. I write about them in detail in the book. And you see they're self-identified revolutionary Marxists. There's a reason why the people they venerate and celebrate are cop killers, are communists like Assata Shakur, people who have fled to Cuba to find political asylum. So these are movements who I don't think it's an overstatement when I say that they're enemies of America, literally. And if you press them on it, they will admit to it as well.
Yeah, so now going back to college campuses, Black Lives Matters for months now has been calling for a defunding of the police. Nowhere is this more popular than in college campuses. Yet the majority of Americans don't support defunding the police. Why do you think that college campuses are out of step with mainstream American politics? Do you think it has anything to do with critical theory?
Well, I actually don't think that the radicalism on campuses are confined to campuses anymore. So back in like 2015-16, I was already at that time in my early journalistic writings bringing attention to what is inevitably going to happen as the radical critical theories of academe flood out into broader society. And that's exactly what happens. And it just needs to reach a certain critical mass for it to really be hugely influential. So Portland is the city, I would say, the entire city is really captured by these radical calls to defund and abolish police. Seattle as well, Minneapolis. I mean, these are places where city council have openly slashed the budgets of their police departments, even as crime is skyrocketing. But in terms of the critical theories that many people are introduced to in academe, that's important because when I've been chronicling all the arrests that have happened in Portland because of the riots that were happening for months, that gave me a sample size of hundreds and hundreds of people. And very meticulously, I would look up not just their names, but the booking photos. I'll get the charges and see what is their background. And unsurprisingly, many of them are in so-called respectable white-collar professions, people who have had benefit of not just an undergraduate education, but master's degree, even PhDs. So there were instructors, people who were training to be a physician, lawyers, attorneys, registered nurses, university students. So it's really important that people challenge the ideologies, but there is no really effort at challenging it where the wellspring is, which would be these institutions to an extent. But Antifa, for their part, have also bypassed some of the gatekeeping of the radicalism that will happen on campuses, in that they now, and for a long time, really disseminate their literature at their events. And because they have so many events now, that literature is going far and wide. So they will condense these theories that are, originally in text that are pretty long into easily readable pamphlets or zines, and these are distributed at their book fairs, at their protests, at their riots. They have them at Chaz, they have them at the Autonomous Zone in Portland. It's really important in part of not just how they recruit, but how they introduce people in very easy to digest pamphlets and booklets. And I know, when you were a part of the radical left, you were making some of these zines too. So
I remember those. I've gone to the Los Angeles and the Orange County anarchist book fairs, and as you said, they just pass out these little pamphlets. I actually have a couple here. You have things that I still have. Perspectives on Anarchist Theory right here, which is it's printed by I think it might be by the AK Press, not 100% sure. The Anarchist Yearbook, 1993, things that I've kept for a while, so from my time in Antifa, and I have a couple more others. It makes sense. They pretty much have to draw the strawman argument of the issues, put them into a booklet form, and then they disseminate to everyone else. But, one of the things that I often hear from a lot of people, a lot of liberals specifically, is they say that, well, Antifa's never killed anybody. So it's foolish to really focus on Antifa because the extreme right, the alt-right, they've killed so many people. So what do you say to those people?
So when I was giving testimony in Congress in August of 2020, Hawaii Senator Hirono repeated that, and I think she was reading a headline from The Guardian or something. So I guess you can make that argument if you don't actually accept the data that shows that there have been some Antifa in the United States in recent years who have carried out killings, attempted killings, and have gotten them killed in the process. So I have a chapter in the book called Deadly Violence, and it lays to rest some of these false claims that we've been brainwashed into thinking that Antifa haven't killed anybody. Months ago in my city, Portland, we had a self-described 100% Antifa militant shoot a Trump supporter, and he was following this guy and laid in wait around the corner and then shot him dead and then fled to a different state before he was killed by federal authorities. And he left behind a sort of manifesto that was on his Instagram, which I was able to save and archive. And in it were his infamous words, "I am 100% Antifa." And he calls for revolution against the state. And before him, there was Willem van Spronsen, also in the Pacific Northwest in Tacoma, Washington, and he launched a firebombing attack on the ICE facility there, and he came armed with a rifle, made a car explode as he was starting these fires, was allegedly attempting to ignite the propane tank that was attached to one of the buildings, and he got shot dead in the process. And he left behind a manifesto. He actually sent a manifesto the previous day to his comrades, and of course they didn't report it to law enforcement. Beyond him, there's others. There's the mass killing by Connor Betts in Ohio in 2019. People brush over that. He killed a lot of people and injured dozens in his mass shooting. And not only did he express support for Antifa, he was part of the Black Bloc in some of these protests in Dayton. So there's him, there's others. I interviewed the ex-wife of the person who was pulled into Antifa extremism, who launched a shooting on school resource officers in Eugene. And these are people who are actually venerated as martyrs by Antifa. So that should tell you everything.
Yeah. Now, this is a bit of a tough question. Now, while I used to be an Antifa, I'm now a conservative. But even then, one of the things that I deeply care about is the civil rights of all Americans, including their due process. And one of the things you do, and which you mentioned a couple of things, is you publish the faces of Antifa rioters or accuse Antifa rioters under your Twitter account before anyone is adjudicated guilty. So doesn't everyone deserve to be held innocent until proven guilty?
Yes, but it's in the public interest to know who is arrested at violent protests and riots and who met the standard for arrest and to be charged. And also, the whole system isn't working in that we have a prosecutor in the county where Portland is who, as a matter of policy, decriminalize felony rioting. So more than 90% of the 1,000+ cases, those people get their charges dropped. That doesn't mean they're innocent, by the way. It's just because the prosecutor is a politician who's elected and wants to be reelected, and there's a certain constituency in Portland who supports the actions of the far left. I do think it's important for the public to see their faces because more than 9 times out of 10, they're not going to face any prosecution anyways. But I mean, it's not like phantoms who are carrying out this violence. These are people who were there, the arrests happened, the charges happened. And I don't make any judgment on them being guilty or not, but they were there. Yeah.
And I think one thing you mentioned is that some of these people, they continually keep getting mugshots, so they're like routine. They're like regulars, like to get their picture taken. So I do like whenever you point out that, like, well, this person didn't get charged. They could have gone in jail, but all of a sudden they committed this even worse act. So I just figure I'd ask just to set some of those doubts away. But I agree with you. It is really important to really expose this because there's so many left-wing politicians who refuse to do anything. And I mean, one of them specifically is Mayor Ted Wheeler. A few weeks ago, a journalist asked him if his failure to act to stop Antifa in Portland set the stage for the Capitol riot on January 6th. Do you think this is true?
Yeah, so that was a local reporter in Portland who asked Ted Wheeler, and of course he was extremely offended by that because I think deep down he probably recognizes that there's good merit to her question. So when I have looked at the comments of people who either express sympathy or support to the rioters on the 6th of January in the Capitol Hill siege, one recurring argument that I am seeing and hearing is that, well, why do BLM and Antifa get to riot and get to damage and get to try to storm government properties? They don't get in legal trouble, they get praise. So why does our side have to play by this rule of nonviolence? You know, we want to act on our political grievances too. And I think the fact that under Mayor Wheeler's watch, not only did he express certain sentiments that seemed to legitimize what was happening in his city last year, him and city council actually worked very hard to kneecap local law enforcement, such as restricting them from cooperating with federal law enforcement when rioters were trying to burn down federal property, banning the use of tear gas and dispersing rioters, so on and so forth. So he really did set a certain context for the nation, I think, or a precedent, I would say, that people are to resolve, that it's okay to resolve their political grievances through violence. And if one side is going to do it, inevitably, the other side will too.
Yeah. And right now, big tech is suppressing a lot of accounts of conservative people. Even I was suspended from Facebook, and I've never violated Facebook's community standards, which came as a shock to me. But yet, Facebook and Twitter have been reluctant to suspend Antifa accounts, which use the platforms to incite actual violence. Why do you think big tech is so reluctant to shut down Antifa accounts, but has already purged thousands of conservative ones?
Well, it's because of the left-wing dominance that are in all these really powerful institutions, whether they be big tech or local governments or academia, entertainment, etc. All these people have staff have a certain sympathy for what they believe to be the cause of Antifa, either out of ignorance or actually as fellow travelers. I've repeatedly tried to bring to Twitter's attention various Antifa accounts that are anonymously run who have been used to promote riots day in and day out in Portland and Seattle. I mean, the riots that happened on the 25th of July last year in multiple cities was done in solidarity with Portland, and it was organized on Twitter and promoted on Twitter. And so, like these Antifa accounts blatantly, obviously violate the terms of service, but they're not held up to the same standard. And that's what, in one way, has made them help to make them so powerful, is that they're not facing really any opposition from anywhere. You know, law enforcement is kneecapped, the federal law enforcement's not doing anything to break up these networks. They're being encouraged by the media or excused. And then you have big tech allowing them to openly not just organize, but actually they'll promote their crowdfunding campaigns, which will bring in literally millions of dollars.
I've seen some of that. So one last question. What do you think Americans should do, not only to stop the growth of Antifa, but to just decrease the amount of political violence from all sides?
There has to be very systematic delegitimization of the tenets of Antifa's ideology that has been mainstreamed. And I'm not sure how that can be done, considering it's been mainstreamed through liberal institutions. And so it's really going to take the mainstream left to be able to counter these arguments from Antifa. And I don't see them having the will or even desire to do that. If anything, 2021, people are leaning more into the radical foundations of ideas that are sort of lead to the rational outcome of what you see Antifa doing. People are leaning more into critical race theory, leaning more into advocacy of defunding police, hatred of the United States, etc. I wish I had a clear answer. I think I want the current administration to succeed, but based on, I think, various advisors to Biden and statements that he's put out, when he talks about violence, extremism, or domestic terrorism, if he's not naming the far left in the same breath that he's naming the far right, that's an issue because they're not even recognizing it or acknowledging it as a problem.
Yeah, and I think that at the very least, we need to really acknowledge that there's a problem, and I think that's one step we could take to stop extremism from both sides. Because, as you mentioned, there's so many people out there who see the far left and they're like, well, they can get away with it, we should too. So once you start tackling both issues, then we'll see the de-radicalization of both sides. Well, thank you, Andy. Now, I mean, this conversation is incredibly important as we move into a Biden presidency. I mean, many people thought that Antifa was merely anti-Trump, but hopefully they'll soon find out that Antifa doesn't like anyone who disagrees with them, including those on the mainstream left, who at one point thought that Antifa was their allies. Now, before you leave, where can people find your book?
It's available wherever books are sold. You can get it on Amazon or in various other stores. And I, again, really thank you for the work that you've done in speaking out about your own experiences and giving me an opportunity to go on your show. I guess for a parting thought, I will say that to piggyback off what you said about how Antifa oppose liberals as well, you know, you can just look at their actions on Inauguration Day in Portland. They held a large banner that said, "We don't want Biden, we want revenge," with an image of a Kalashnikov rifle, and they proceeded to march to the headquarters of the Democrat Party of Oregon and destroy the building.
Yeah, that's definitely a problem, and hopefully they will never get the revenge. But thank you. This has been Gabriel Nadales for the Leadership Institute's Campus Reform. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for watching this video. If you want to learn more about the Leadership Institute, click here. If you want to learn more about my story and buy my book, you can click here. And while you're at it, you can click down here to subscribe. If you want to keep Leadership Institute videos free, please consider making a tax-deductible donation.